The explosion of journalism. Ignacio Ramonet. He has been a Spanish journalist, professor of communication theory established in France and one of the main figures of the alternative world movement. The explosion of journalism. Internet puts traditional media in check. Chapter 1. An ecosystem change. The bad thing about this golden age of communication and information is that there is no way of knowing what is going on. The broken planet media is experiencing a commotion of an intensity never before known. The impact of the internet meteorite, comparable to the one that made the dinosaurs disappear, is causing a radical change in the entire media ecosystem and the massive extinction of newspapers of the written press. The digitization of the world is rapidly transforming the informational biotope. Consequence, dozens of newspapers are on the verge of ruin or have gone bankrupt. Their old economic model has disintegrated. Journalistic practice itself, afflicted by a systemic crisis, must be rebuilt and reinvented. As stated by an expert in new media, the DNA of information has changed. We must change the DNA of journalists, and not only the genetic code of the written press. The commotion also reaches radio and television, especially the continuous news channels, which for the most part are without hope of salvation. Its audience has not yet taken off, its commercial results continue to show losses, and its best journalists are migrating towards documentaries. We are experiencing a paradigm shift. A revolution that advances in great jerks, with violent accelerations and frequent pauses, although it is not universal, since we must not forget the existence, in a profoundly unequal world, of the considerable north-south abyss that separates the rich and the poor, the info-rich and the info-poor. Most likely, the written press, a means of communication of the industrial age, will not disappear. But information no longer circulates as before, in precise, controlled, well-corrected and calibrated units. It is no longer presented only in its traditional closed forms, agency cables, printed newspapers, radio newscasts, television news. Converted into something immaterial, it now takes the form of a fluid that circulates in open segments through the internet almost at the speed of light. Social networks and Web 2.0 allow web actors to complete each piece of news by adding a nuance, a comment, a quote, a photo, or a video, in what could be called a work of collective intelligence or alchemy of the multitudes, in the words of Francis Pisani, in constant progress. Internet is totalizing, and establishes, not without risks, a new logic, different from the Fordist production, typical of the industrial age. At that time, although a plurality of specialized workers could contribute to the manufacture of a product, it, in the end, was delivered complete, finished, closed, and corresponded point by point with the initial project. This is not like that. The logic of online information is to launch raw news, sometimes even approximate, to later correct it, modify it, or enrich it permanently and at any time. Information is becoming a work in progress, a material in constant evolution, a kind of conversation, a dynamic truth-seeking process, rather than a finished product. Before, a journalist's article would only appear on the front page if the boss decided so, Francis Pisani and Dominique Piotet explain. Today, that same article can jump to the fore as being the most read, the most emailed, or the most linked to in blogs. The internet is not a means of communication, says Jeff Jarvis, professor of journalism at the City University of New York and blogger, www.buzzmachine.com. It is a society, a space where we can connect with others. Media people see the internet as a means of communication, but is not. General information newspapers continue to be anchored in an economic model that no longer works. The times when almost all newspapers published the same general information are history. The market is ruthless in the face of a press and newspapers incapable of generating profits. The big ones. Television networks are not saved. His model has also become obsolete. And the solution consisting of building, through mergers and concentrations, large international multimedia groups, as was done in the 1980s and 1990s, has been ineffective in the face of the proliferation of new forms of dissemination of information, culture, and leisure via Internet. Under these conditions, what guarantee of survival does quality journalism have? Is there no other choice, to continue existing, than to resort to subsidies from patrons, foundations, or the state? Paradoxically, the audience of the written press has never been so important. In the network society, Internet users continue to seek access to traditional media, especially those publications considered more serious written press, and visit their online news pages. The number of readers of these newspapers has increased exceptionally thanks to the web. Among the 200 most visited online information websites in the United States, traditional media accounts for 67% of traffic. The remaining 33% comes from content aggregators such as Google News, Yahoo News, and the websites called pure players, that is, those present only on the Internet. The number one online world press, the New York Times, whose print circulation amounts to 950,000 copies, is read by 43.7 million Internet users. In France, the Le Figaro and Le Monde websites are visited by more than 5 million readers per month. Another important fact is that online information continues to depend on old media. 80% of the links found on news websites, blogs, or US social networks refer to traditional media. The novelty lies in the fact that people who access the contents of newspapers in this way want to be read and listened to. Information no longer flows in one direction. The vertical logic that characterized the relationship between the media and readers is increasingly horizontal or circular. Episode 2. Erosion of media credibility. In addition to the Internet revolution, what other factors have aggravated the decline of print newspapers? In the first place, a conjunctural element, the world economic crisis that translates, as we have already pointed out, into a decrease in advertising revenue. This crisis broke out at the least opportune moment, September 2008, for a press that suffered from old structural problems, the extreme commodification of information, financial speculation, with the IPO, on occasions, of the media, and the flight forward, through mergers and concentrations, of the large media groups, the excessive dependence on advertising, competition from free newspapers, the aging of the press reader. In addition, another important change has taken place. People are no longer faithful to a newspaper. Before, the regular reading of a newspaper gave the reader a certain political identity. This is no longer the case because most of the publications, in the hope of covering everything and capturing readers of any sign, have made their editorial line imperceptible and blurred their image. The readers feel betrayed and, consequently, no longer consider themselves bound by any pact of fidelity. Proof of this is the testimony of an Internet user who does not hold his tongue. Liberation, Les Rocks, Le Monde, among others, are newspapers that I haven't bought for a long time. I like to be well informed too much to waste my time. In my opinion, they are nothing more than niche press, dead press, stagnant in their position. I used to like them, just like Actual for a while and Charlie Hebdo before the Valacrature, but I'm not faithful. If a publication no longer meets my expectations or betrays much of what made it interesting, I stop buying it. Likewise, there is a permanent confusion between communication and information. The world of communication, whose job is to spread complacent and flattering messages in favor of the companies that commission them, tends to overlap with that of information. The dikes between the two spheres are beginning to break. It is increasingly difficult to distinguish a communicator from a journalist. And that their functions are very different, one praises while the other informs. New hybrid specialties are emerging: institutional journalist, company journalist, public relations journalist. Which makes us ask ourselves the following question: a journalist who is paid by a company and whose articles, all favorable to the actions of the company that hires him, are reviewed and validated by the directors of the company. Is he really a journalist? Such a mix of activities damages public confidence and deals a serious blow to the credibility of the information world. Added to these factors is a great reproach, the erosion of credibility. Citizens distrust a press belonging to a handful of oligarchs who also largely control economic power and often act in collusion with political powers. Common sense warns that, when a businessman buys a newspaper, he almost always does so either to defend a political system whose triumph interests him, or to become himself a politician by making himself feared. In any case, it will rarely do it for the love of quality, independent information. Excessive concentration. In France, after a succession of capitalist maneuvers, several struggling press publishers have recently been acquired, for prestige or as vectors of influence, by businessmen. Some of them are friends of President Nicolas Sarkozy, who, since then, directly and personally appoints the presidents of public radio and television groups. As early as 1843, Balzac stated, "For a businessman a newspaper is a capital investment for which he receives interest mainly in the form of influence and pleasure, and only sometimes money." Only 5 groups dominate the French mass media: Hachette Lagardère, Prisma Presse, Mondadori France, Bayard Presse and L'Express L'Expansion. As for the national daily press, published in Paris for the whole of France, it only has 3 main players: the Figaro Soc Press Group, the Amaury Group, Le Parisien, L'Équipe, and the Le Monde Group. In this way, the French written press is concentrated in the hands of a small group of oligarchs. Serge Dassault, president of the Dassault Group, manufacturer of aircraft, including the Mirage and Rafale fighter bombers, who took over Le Figaro in 2004 and is now trying to take over the popular newspaper Le Parisien aujourd'hui in France. Bernard Arnault, president of the luxury group LVMH, owner of the brands Vuitton, Dior, Kenzo, Tag Heuer, Loewe, Moët and Chandon, Guerlain, etc., which bought the main economic newspaper Les Echos. Alain Weil, of Next Radio TV, owner of the RMC radio station, and of the BFM TV television channel, which acquired, at the beginning of 2008, the other large financial newspaper La Tribune from the LVMH group, and which announced, in May 2010, that it sold it for a symbolic euro to its general director, Valérie Decamp, Edouard de Rothschild, from the Rothschild and CIE Bank, which acquired the newspaper Liberation in 2004, Alexander Pogachev, son of the disgraced Russian banker Sergei Pogachev, who bought France Soir. And finally, the trio of businessmen made up of Pierre Berga, former president of the firm Yves Saint Laurent, Xavier Niel, of the Iliad Group, parent company of Free, the main internet access provider, and Mathieu Pigas, of Lazard Banking, and owner of the weekly Les Inrecuptibles, who in November 2010 became the owner of Le Monde, a newspaper with significant debts, led by a team quite demoralized since the spectacular revelations made in 2003 by Pierre Pien and Philippe Cohen in their book of investigation La Face Cachée du Monde, The Hidden Face of Le Monde, and that between 2007 and 2011 has seen no less than 4 directors parade. Healthy ideas. This wave of concentrations harms pluralism, and Serge Dassault's statements in September 2004 confirmed all fears. As soon as he took office, the new owner of the newspaper Le Figaro told the editors, "I would like, as much as possible, that the newspaper would highlight our companies more. I think that sometimes there is information that requires a lot of caution, such as articles that talk about contracts still under negotiation. There is news that does more harm than good, and we run the risk of endangering the commercial and industrial interests of our country." Obviously what Serge Dassault calls our country is his company, Dassault Aviation. And no doubt to protect her, he censored an interview in August 2004 with Andrew Wang, a middleman involved in a $500 million operation in hidden commissions for the sale of 6 Lafayette frigates in Taiwan in 1992. as did a news story about the talks between Jacques Chirac and Abdelaziz Bouteflika regarding a project to sell Rafale aircraft to Algeria. Recently, Serge Dassault found an article by George Ismail Brunat titled Israel's Secret Business in the Persian Gulf, which was published in Le Figaro on June 26, 2010, inappropriate for his plans to sell Rafale aircraft in the Middle East. Very irritated, the owner of the newspaper demanded that the head of the Figaro Group, Francis Morel, fire the journalist. Faced with Morel's refusal, in the end it was the latter who was fired from the newspaper in January 2011. On the other hand, Serge Dassault's explanations about the reasons that led him to buy Le Figaro, a newspaper, he confessed, makes it possible to spread a good number of healthy ideas, did not reassure the newspaper's editorial staff. If to these statements we add the unforgettable words that Patrick Lelay, then director of the TF1 channel, spoke in July 2004 in relation to the true mission of the French media giant TF1's role is to help Coca-Cola to sell your product. What we sell to Coca-Cola is available human brain time. We can see the dangers involved in mixing such contradictory activities as commercial obsession and information ethics. In the regional press, the conflicts of interest and the confusion between communication and information are sometimes even more alarming. In Alsace, the Credit Mutual Bank, headed by Michel Lucas, took control in November 2010 of the L'Est Républicain Group, of which the Dernières Nouvelles d'Alsace, DNA, and L'Alsace newspapers are part. Like other media owners, this bank assumes that it can determine its content. For example, in January 2011, on the occasion of a credit mutual aid operation in Haiti, a report extolling this solidarity advertising action was published in the group's newspapers, which provoked protests from the unions who denounced the pressures from the bank, the mutualization and standardization of holders and this way of making a profit on an investment. They also lamented an attitude that can only damage the impartiality and credibility of the newspapers involved. This mix of activities can go a long way without readers and viewers realizing it. For example, the large media groups are listed on the stock exchange. Does this fact have any influence on the contents? Yes, the media that they own tend to censor news that can harm them. Already in the year 2000, in a report by the Pew Research Center, 35% of the journalists questioned thought that news likely to cause a conflict of interest in their companies was not published. And Walter Wells, former director of the International Herald Tribune, whose sole shareholder is the New York Times company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, warns about the consequences of the IPO of press companies, since their priority objective is already therefore, it will not be to provide independent information but to obtain benefits for its shareholders. It is common for those who have to make a journalistic decision to wonder if it will raise or lower the stock market value of the publishing group's shares by a few cents. This type of question has become something capital. The directors of newspapers constantly receive directives in this sense from the financial owners of the newspaper. It is a new fact of contemporary journalism. This was not like that before. It must also be taken into account that a fifth of the members of the boards of directors of the 1,000 main North American companies are also administrators of the big media. Can one then be surprised that newspapers owned by multimedia groups adopt, as an editorial line, the defense of their company's strategy? Some newspapers, convinced that the historical objective of the media in democracies consists of training society, do not hesitate to impose on readers a subjective and partial conception of information, thus emptying the concept of free press of meaning, which they use as if it were a purely ideological argument. Media political inbreeding. We must also take into account the discredit of the dominant journalists, who are increasingly considered a professional and social category in a state of levitation, that is, without their feet in reality, without true contact with the society, and in permanent complicity and consanguinity with the political class which, in turn, finds itself enormously discredited. Anecdotally, let us remember in this regard that France is the country in Europe with the highest percentage of political media inbreeding due to the many couples that in real life are made up of politicians and journalists, Dominique Strauss-Kahn and Anne Sinclair, Bernard Kouchner and Christina Krent, Jean-Louis Borloo and Beatrice Schoenberg, etc. Taken to this extreme, say Philippe Cohen and Elizabeth Levy, concubinage between politicians and journalists is lethal for the latter and can be for the former. In most opinion democracies there is, among the dominant journalists, a kind of compadrio full of complicity and collusion. It is, as Serge Halimi has rightly described, a small group of omnipresent journalists, whose power is backed by the law of silence, who impose their concept of information merchandise on a profession that is increasingly weakened by fear of unemployment. They form, in complicity with the political leaders, a kind of frivolous and worldly court, where they slavishly praise each other with soulful attention in the hope of obtaining some favor in return. They invite each other, they frequent the same fashionable restaurants, the same summer resorts, and when they have to debate in public, they indulge in the ritual of a harmless and predictable ceremony. In this sense, the famous Le Siècle dinners are the most notorious example of this complicity. On the fourth Wednesday of each month, prominent French journalists, including Arlette Chabot, Claude Imbert, Laurent Geoffrin, and Serge Gelai, flock to the salons of the prestigious Automobile Club de France, in Paris Place de la Concorde, to meet with the most powerful members of the French ruling elites. Le Siècle, a very private company that has been organizing these meetings for more than 60 years, is one of the most effective instruments of soft power in France. This self-absorbed pseudo-nobility not only fascinates journalists from traditional media, but also those from digital media. The minister, former socialist converted to Sarkozyism, Eric Besson already knew this in 2008 when, at the head of the government's digital economy, he invited well-known bloggers who did not make themselves beg. After succeeding him from January 2009 to November 2010, Nathalie Kosciusko-Morizet continued the seduction-corruption operation on an even larger scale and in an even more colorful setting. She used to invite the crème de la crème of the French blogobourgeoisie to the magnificent salons of the Mansion de Broglie, located on Rue de Varennes in Paris. Through sumptuous and worldly dinners, the Secretary of State bought the complicity of the most influential bloggers, always giving lessons to professional journalists, who ran to feast and wallow in a disgusting moral corruption. Also, the true elites have always liked the shade and discretion. By definition they are horrified by transparency. Any power that is too exposed to the media spotlight, such as political power today, quickly becomes discredited and devalued. For this reason, the financial power, invisible, indecipherable, and hidden, and that of the media, which does not consent to any criticism, have never been as intimidating as they are now. This situation is alarming to the point that it leads us to state that the dominant media are currently a serious problem for democracy. They no longer contribute to expanding the democratic field but rather insist on restricting and undermining it. Democratic censorship. Little by little, citizens are becoming aware of these new dangers and begin to show great mistrust of media manipulation. Paradoxically, they fear finding themselves, in the supermediatized societies in which we live, in a state of information insecurity. As the reliability of the media declines as information proliferates, a new phenomenon is emerging: democratic censorship. We used to think that censorship was typical of authoritarian regimes, which usually act through amputations and prohibitions of information, and place obstacles between free information and citizens that hinder the free circulation of news. But nowadays, in democratic societies, information has become so abundant and so infected with parasites, soft news, infotainment, trash news, that it literally suffocates us and prevents us from knowing what other information is hidden from us. Today, between freedom of information and citizens there is a wall of information practically as insurmountable as the obstacles that dictators put up. In other words, this wall of information is precisely what now prevents us from accessing information. This excess blocks the path to knowledge. Contemporary man therefore runs the risk of becoming ignorant, saturated with information. The credibility crisis of the media also has other causes. Speculative, entertainment and show journalism triumphs to the detriment of demand and quality. The staging of the information prevails over the verification of the facts. In online media, new journalists tend to spend more time disseminating news than researching information or reflecting. They are now clearly more reactive and less meditative and are more attentive to events but less sensitive to the context. Another transcendental issue is the obsession with speed, with an immediacy that leads the media to make more and more mistakes and confuse rumors with proven facts. The internet rage has also reached online news readers. Nicholas Carr, specialist in new technologies and author of the book The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Shallow. What is the Internet doing with our minds, affirms that the Internet, computers, Google, Twitter and multitasking they distance us from forms of thought that require reflection and concentration, which gradually transforms our way of intellectual functioning. They make us more efficient beings processing information but less able to delve into that information. The Internet, with its motley hypertext and its immense amount of information, invites us to move between content, and could make us lose the ability to read long and complex texts. The death of the fourth power. In this way, the media, instead of raising a wall against these drifts, have contributed to discrediting the so-called fourth power. We must remember that, since the second half of the 21st century, the press and the media have constituted, in democracies, the recourse of citizens against the abuses of the three traditional powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, that are likely to fail and to make mistakes. We are not talking about authoritarian states where political power is, by definition, responsible for any violation of human rights and censorship of freedoms. In democratic regimes, where laws are voted democratically, governments are born from universal suffrage and justice is independent of the executive, serious abuses can be committed. It can happen, for example, that justice condemns an innocent person, see the Dreyfus case in France, or that the parliament votes iniquitous laws. The United Kingdom, France, Belgium, or the Netherlands colonized Africa with the consent of their legislative assemblies, or segregationist laws against certain sectors of the population. This was the case in the United States, for more than a century, with African Americans enslaved with the democratic consent of Congress. Finally, democratic governments can apply policies that discriminate against a segment of the population. This currently occurs in some countries of the European Union with the gypsies and the undocumented. Traditionally, in democratic contexts, journalists and the media considered that their duty was to denounce these rights violations, and on some occasions they have paid dearly for it by being victims of attacks, disappearances, murders, as is still the case in Mexico, Honduras, Colombia, Guatemala, Turkey, Pakistan, Russia, Philippines, and many other countries. This is the reason why for a long time there has been talk of a fourth power, although in reality it was a counterpower since it acted as a counterweight to the other three, which was, moreover, the one that allowed the emergence, in modern democracies, of a decisive actor, public opinion. The latter did not exist before the flourishing of the mass media at the end of the 19th century. This fourth power was, in short, thanks to the civic sense of the media and the courage of the journalists themselves, the power that citizens had to criticize, reject, and oppose democratically the political or judicial decisions that, although legal, they could be unfair or even criminal. The press, as we have already pointed out, was then the voice of the voiceless. In the last 20 years, with the advance of economic globalization, the content of the fourth power has been emptied of meaning. It has lost its essential function of counterpower. A single sphere. Today, the real power is in the hands of a handful of economic and financial groups and multinational companies with even greater influence than the states themselves in world affairs. They are the new masters of the world. In this new geo-economic framework, a decisive metamorphosis has taken place in the field of mass media. The digital revolution has broken down the borders that separated the three traditional forms of communication, sound, the written word and the image, and has favored the rise of the Internet, which represents a fourth way of communicating, a new way of expressing oneself, of to get information, to create, to consume, to be distracted, to establish relationships. But the media companies not only aspire to group together all types of media, publishing, photography, press, radio, cinema, television, internet, but they also intend to carry out all the activities belonging to three large spheres: mass culture, communication, and information, which until now were autonomous. On the one hand, mass culture, with its commercial logic, its popular creations and its essentially commercial objectives; on the other hand, communication, advertising, marketing, propaganda, and the rhetoric of persuasion; and finally, information, with its press agencies, radio or television newscasts, the written press, continuous news channels, online news websites and blogs, that is, the universe of all journalism. These three spheres, previously well differentiated, have been merging little by little to form a single colossal sphere in which it is increasingly difficult to distinguish activities related to mass culture from those related to communication, information, or the Internet. The Internet is absorbing everything, everything is now on the Internet. Increasingly, the new media companies, producers of symbols, spread messages of all kinds combining television, cartoons, movies, video games, music CDs, DVDs, publishing, web pages, leisure cities, such as Disneyland, sports, show, etc. In other words, new media companies have two singularities. First of all, they deal with everything that has to do with the written word, image, and sound, and spread it through various channels: written press, radio, television, internet, telephone, tablets. And second, these companies are global and not just national or local. But the new giants of the net, like Google, Yahoo or Facebook, have a decisive advantage: they were born into the new ecosystem and are much better adapted to an environment in which the Internet is the oxygen. In 1941, Orson Welles attacked the superpowers of Citizen Kane. However, compared to today's global media giants, Kane's power was negligible. Kane, who owned a few print dailies in a single country, wielded minuscule power, although not ineffective locally or nationally, compared to the heavy artillery of the new media behemoths. A strategic raw material. Communication, including computers, electronics, and telephony, has become a strategic raw material, and it is the new giants of these sectors who control it. The turnover of communication industries in a broad sense, computer, internet, telephony, media, culture, video games, advertising, social networks, which amounted to nearly €1 billion in 1995, increased in 2010 to nearly €3 trillion, which represents approximately 15% of world GDP. Globalization is therefore also the globalization of the mass media, communication, information, and the Internet. The masters of the Internet are the same from one end of the planet to the other: Time Warner, Walt Disney Company, News Corporation, and Bertelsmann, dominating the entertainment industries; 37, Hewlett-Packard, Samsung, Dell, and Hitachi, leading electronics groups for the general public; AT&T, NTT, Verizon, and Deutsche Telekom, dominating the telecommunications market; Alcatel, Nokia, Cisco Systems, and Motorola, leading manufacturers of telecommunications equipment; Hewlett-Packard, Dell, Acer and Lenovo, reigning in the computer equipment market; Microsoft, Oracle Corporation, Symantec, and SAP AG, leading manufacturers of computer software; Facebook, MySpace, and Twitter, the main social networks; Google, Yahoo, and Bing, at the head of the search engines; and other multinationals such as Apple, Sony, LG, Philips, eBay, owner of PayPal, Amazon, etc. The large media groups, concerned with maintaining their gigantic empires and conquering new markets, which forces them to court other powers, do not set themselves the civic goal of becoming the fourth power, nor do they denounce the abuses against the right, nor correct the dysfunctions of democracy. They don't even want to set themselves up as a fourth estate, much less act as a counterpower. If they continue to proclaim themselves fourth power, it is because they have now joined the other three dominant powers, politics, economics, and finance. And because, in turn, they have no qualms about submitting, as a supplementary power, as media power, to the citizens. Media wars. How to resist the offensive of this new power that in some way betrays the citizens and that has gone with all its powerful weapons of persuasion to the side of the oppressor. Our proposal is the creation of a fifth power whose function would be to denounce the superpower of some large media groups that, in certain circumstances, not only do not defend citizens but act against them, as is currently the case in a good number of countries. In Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Argentina, and in other countries where the conservative opposition has been defeated in democratic elections, the main press, radio, and television groups have unleashed a true media war against the legitimacy of new presidents like Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales or Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. In the United States, the media of the Republican right also did not accept the election, in 2008, of President Barack Obama. His hate offensives against the different measures advocated by the Obama administration, in particular against health reform, have led to an extreme polarization of political life and have favored the rise of the Tea Party, a movement that proclaims itself of the extreme right and whose followers display large photos of Barack Obama ridiculed with Hitler's mustache. Rush Limbaugh, an ultra-conservative radio host, considered one of the 50 most influential media personalities in the United States, pockets $50 million a year for provoking and relentlessly attacking Barack Obama, whom he describes as a black magician, a cretin and a demonic. The ultra-conservative media outlets of Rupert Murdoch's News Corp group, in particular Fox News, are the mouthpieces of all his campaigns. Popular Fox News host Glenn Beck is known for calling Barack Obama a racist. On populist cable channels, another superstar, Bill O'Reilly, lashes out at Obama every day with false truths and racist allusions, and mocks Muslims. At the beginning of 2011, the Republican billionaire Donald Trump, who directs a reality television broadcast The Apprentice on the NBC network, viciously returned to the absurd accusations against Obama, denying against all evidence that the president had been born in the United States and questioning the legality of their diplomas obtained at Columbia and Harvard universities. All the conservative media took up these arguments to try to delegitimize Obama. With poisonous rhetoric, these media hype and bait Americans 24/7, perpetually inducing paranoia and creating a dangerous climate of violence. Some analysts accuse them of having been the intellectual authors of the Tucson massacre, in which a 22-year-old man, on January 8, 2011, shot point-blank into the crowd present at a Democratic rally, causing 6 deaths and 14 deaths. Wounded, including the Democratic Congresswoman-elect in Arizona, Gabrielle Giffords, who received a serious gunshot wound to the head. The ideological apparatus of globalization. In the new ideological war that globalization originates, the media are used as a combat weapon. They have abandoned the role of fourth power and aspire to defend their caste privileges. As in other times the landed oligarchy did, the current owners of media estates oppose any kind of social reform and any fairer redistribution of the immense national wealth. The cases cited are a clear example of the new international situation in which various media groups, now enraged, openly assume their new role as watchdogs of the established economic disorder and their new condition of anti-popular power. These large groups not only set themselves up as media power but have also become, above all, the ideological apparatus of globalization. They no longer act as media but as authentic political parties. They do not claim the right to criticism but rather rise up as an ideological opposition. Its true mission is to curb popular demands. His model continues to be Silvio Berlusconi, leader of the main Italian communication group, democratically elected president of the council. Berlusconi has shown that, when one owns the first fortune of a country and controls its main media group, winning, democratically, national elections constitutes a simple formality. The dirty war of the media that is currently taking place in a good number of states against democratic presidents is the replica of what the newspaper El Mercurio did in Chile, at the beginning of the 1970s, against the government of President Salvador Allende, and which led to the military coup of September 11, 1973. These campaigns with which the media try to end democracy continue. The president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, victim of an attempted coup on September 30, 2010, accused the media, considering that their responsibility in this putsch was enormous. The media are permanent conspirators. They are the watchdogs of the status quo. The people of Quito were incited, instigated, and manipulated for weeks by a corrupt press. That is what we have received permanently since our first day in government, especially for not passively submitting to the press, which is considered an all-embracing power. In Honduras, on June 28, 2009, President Manuel Zelaya had less luck. He was overthrown by a coup organized by an alliance between the powers of the traditional oligarchy and those of the classical reaction, armed forces, church, joined by the media powers. Together, and in the name of freedom of expression, they attacked the democratically voted reforms that defended the interests of the majority of the population. This is the media landscape of globalization. Mass media and liberal globalization go hand in hand. It is urgent to demand that the big media allow their journalists to act based on their freedom of conscience and not based on the interests of the groups, companies, and employers who hire them. Contaminated information. Due to the explosion, multiplication, and overabundance of information, it is literally contaminated, poisoned by lies of all kinds, intoxicated by rumors, deformations, distortions, and manipulations. What has already happened in the food sector is taking place in this area. For a long time, food was scarce, and this is still the case in many parts of the planet, but when around 1950, thanks to the agricultural revolutions, the countryside began to produce in abundance, especially in the countries of Western Europe and America North, the population began to realize that many foods were contaminated, poisoned by pesticides, and were causing numerous health problems, obesity, cardiovascular diseases, cancer, which triggered mass panic, as happened in the 1980s. With the mad cow epidemic. These events made us aware that although we could die of hunger before, now we could die from eating contaminated food. The same thing happens with information. It has been very scarce throughout history, and even today there are dictatorial regimes in which complete and reliable information is not available. However, in democratic states, information overflows and, as we have seen, suffocates us. The Greek philosopher Empedocles said that the world was formed by the combination of four elements: air, water, earth, and fire. In the digital age, information is so abundant that it constitutes the fifth element of our globalized world. And as you can see, as with food, the information is contaminated. It often poisons our minds, pollutes the brain, intoxicates us, and tries to inject into our unconscious ideas that are not ours. For this reason, more and more citizens are calling for what could be called an information ecology that cleans and tidies up information from all that black tide of lies. It is necessary to decontaminate the information and demand a decrease in its volume. Less information but better information. In the same way that there are organic foods, in principle less contaminated than the rest, we should be able to obtain a kind of organic information, be able to buy a newspaper with the no lies seal, consult a website that displays the label devoid of rumors, watching a television program with the label not tested on citizens, or listening to the jingle produced with verified information on the radio. A large number of citizens are worried about the new arrogance of the big communication industries. The dominant media give priority to their private interests to the detriment of the public interest, confuse freedom of expression and freedom of enterprise, and consider that the latter is the first of freedoms. This is an abuse. The freedom of business cannot, in any way, prevail over the right of citizens to have rigorous and truthful information, nor serve as a pretext for the dissemination of false news, defamation, or mass manipulation campaigns. Freedom of the media is nothing more than the extension of collective freedom of expression, the foundation of democracy. And as such it cannot be confiscated by a handful of oligarchs. We must not forget that the media continue to be, in the rule of law, the only power without counterpower, which creates a detrimental imbalance for democracy. The explosion of journalism. Ignacio Ramonet.